may I talk to you about one of the greatest men who has ever lived, and you've never heard of him, Toyohiko Kagawa, a Japanese Christian, born of a prostitute and a businessman, illegitimate birth. His parents died by the time he was 5, brought up by a grandmother who never talked to him except to slap him. No friends. But he met a Japanese Christian who took him to see 2 American missionaries, and they took him into their home, and he became a Christian, and what a Christian. He gave 15 years of his life to the slums of Japan. He went to an area where there were 10,000 people living in garbage-filled areas, homes that were 6 feet square. The paths between were filled with smelly rubbish. He'd share his bed with someone that had itching disease all over them. He got TB and other diseases, and yet he survived. For 15 years he ministered to prostitutes, criminals, people that were poverty-stricken. It had started when he put his few possessions in a wheelbarrow and moved to one of those 6 foot square dwelling places. But he became well known in Japan and the world. He went to Princeton Theological Seminary. He earned degrees, recommended several times for Nobel Prizes, peace and other things. He was a social agitator. He worked for Japanese men to get the vote. Then he worked for Japanese women to get the vote. After the great earthquake in 1923, the government called on Kagawa to help people get re-established. Sometimes he was imprisoned because he was against things the government did, and he didn't care what happened to him. God mightily used him. He wrote 130 books. He spoke often to people, and what he wrote is very much worth our reading today. Let me read you a paragraph. There's nothing more exhilarating than to walk through the world unencumbered. If possessions abound, there's a haunting fear that they may be stolen. If you are beautifully gowned, you worry lest your garments be soiled. If you are high of rank, you are anxious lest you be thrown down. If you pride yourself on being erudite, you're cut to the quick if someone makes light of you. Stripped to the skin, stripped to the skin. That's the way to walk. There are several books on him. This is one of them, Kagawa. I recommend it. There's a larger book, same title, and I recommend that too. He was a truly great man. Now let me talk to you about Eric Metaxas. This is an American who in recent years has become well known in the world. As a matter of fact, our Australian newspaper, called The Australian, they published an article that he'd written for an American economic journal, the most well-known economic journal in the world. And what was it about? Well, he said that we've been trying to find evidence of people alive on other planets. We've been trying for decades. He said we haven't had any success. And we've come to realise that our universe is a marvellously constructed place, that it took a personal God to make it. And he gave reasons for that conclusion, Eric Metaxas. And this was printed in an economic journal in America and then reprinted a few years ago in the Australian magazine. Recently he's written 7 Men and another book like it, 7 Women. He points out women who've changed the world and men who've changed the world. I recommend to you Eric Metaxas, worth reading. He's written one called Amazing Grace, and you know who that's about, John Newton. Some time ago I mentioned to you the story of Adoniram Judson, and I think I mentioned that before he got married, he wrote a letter to the prospective father-in-law. Since talking to you, I've come across the letter, and I want to read you some of it. This is what it means to be a Christian missionary. This is written to Nancy Hazeltine's father when Adoniram Judson wanted to become engaged. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world, whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life, whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate. Foolish and inexperienced young people are apt to embark and will actually sail to the far distant shores of Hindustan. And marvellous to tell, to teach that numerous and ancient people the right way to heaven. Well, I doubt that's the ideal way to convince a possible father-in-law, but it was true. And Nancy died caring for her husband. People loved her, heathen people loved her. I recommend to you the books of Adoniram Judson. Have you heard of Ravi Zacharias, who wanted suicide when he was very young, but found the gospel? He's written several wonderful books. This one's the real face of atheism, but all of them are good. Now I want to talk to you about science. Here's a physicist, Alan Hayward, recently reprinted Creation and Evolution, the Facts and the Fallacies. If you are sometimes bold enough to talk on the topic of evolution, Jill and I have written a very large book on it called Genesis versus Darwinism. But here's one by a well-known physicist, The Facts and the Fallacies in Creation and Evolution. He points out some things as Christians we should not say when we argue about Genesis. And he points out the things we should say when we argue about Genesis. I recommend to you this book. You've probably never heard the first and last words of Spurgeon at the Metropolitan Tabernacle. If I can read the small print, I'll try and give it to you. Here are the first words at that great tabernacle that held over 6,000 people, where he sometimes took up to 10 meetings a week at the tabernacle or nearby. Spurgeon worked himself to death. So many people made demands on him. I told you, 500 letters a week, and he thought he should answer them. I'm not that conscientious. I know I couldn't do it, but he did it. Here are the first words he said at the tabernacle. Listen very closely. I would propose that the subject of the ministry of this house, as long as this platform shall stand, and so long as this house shall be frequented by worshippers, shall be the person of Jesus Christ. If I'm asked to say what is my creed, I think I must reply, it is Jesus. My venerable predecessor, Dr. Gill, has left a body of divinity, admirable, excellent in its way, but the body of divinity to which I would give and bind myself forever, God helping me, is not his system of divinity or any other, but Christ Jesus, who's the sum and substance of the gospel, who is in himself all theology, the incarnation of every precious truth, the glorious personal embodiment of the way, the truth, and the life. That's when he began, where he would preach for over 30 years, over 6,000 people. He told his own congregation to stay away certain times so that other people could come who'd never been able to get in. Now here are his last words. He's about to die. If you wear the livery of Christ, you'll find him so meek and lowly of heart that you will find rest unto your souls. He is the most magnanimous of captains. There never was his like among the choicest of princes. He is always to be found in the thickest part of the battle. When the wind blows cold, he always takes the bleak side of the hill. The heaviest end of the cross lies ever on his shoulders. If he bids us carry a burden, he carries it also. If there's anything that is gracious, generous, kind and tender, yea, lavish and superabundant in love, you always find it in him. His service is life, peace, joy. Oh, that you'd enter on it at once. God help you to enlist under the banner of Jesus Christ. I mentioned to you his most well-known book, Evening and Morning, sometimes published separately, evening by evening, morning by morning. A page for each day of the year. You'll never be the same after reading Spurgeon's Evening by Evening or Morning by Morning. But you can also read the biographies put together by his wife, a wonderful woman. She supervised the sending out of 250,000 of books on the gospel to ministers who couldn't afford to buy them. Sick woman for many years, but lived many years after Spurgeon. They had 2 sons, twins. They both became ministers. Thomas Spurgeon followed his father in the pulpit of Metropolitan Tabernacle. I recommend to you the Sermons of Spurgeon, and he wrote over 100 books. I recommend those also. God bless you.